Welcome to Spooky Stories and Creepy Tales, where I, Silas Darkwood, narrate stories of horror and dread. Tonight, The Shadow Kingdom by Robert E. Howard, the story where a king on a stolen throne discovers the greatest threat to his reign isn't a rival or a rebel. It's the possibility that the men standing closest to him have never been men at all. If you enjoy Robert E. Howard or pulp horror, you're in the right place. So dim the lights, pull up the blankets, and don't trust anyone. The Shadow Kingdom by Robert E. Howard. 1. A king comes riding. The blare of the trumpets grew louder, like a deep golden tide surge, like the soft booming of the evening tides against the silver beaches of Valusia. The throng shouted. Women flung roses from the roofs as the rhythmic chiming of silver hooves came clearer, and the first of the mighty array swung into view in the broad white street that curved round the golden-spired tower of splendor. First came the trumpeters, slim youths, clad in scarlet, riding with a flourish of long, slender golden trumpets. Next the bowmen, tall men from the mountains, and behind these the heavily armed footmen, their broad shields clashing in unison, their long spears swaying in perfect rhythm to their stride. Behind them came the mightiest soldiery in all the world, the Red Slayers, horsemen, splendidly mounted, armed in red from helmet to spur. Proudly they sat on their steeds, looking neither to right nor left, but aware of the shouting for all that. Like bronze statues they were, and there was never a waver in the forest of spears that reared above them. Behind those proud and terrible ranks came the motley files of the mercenaries, fierce, wild-looking warriors, men of Mu and Ka-U, and of the hills to the east and the isles of the west. They bore spears and heavy swords, and a compact group that marched somewhat apart were the bowmen of Lemuria. Then came the light foot of the nation, and more trumpeters brought up the rear. A brave sight, and a sight which aroused a fierce thrill in the soul of Kull, King of Valusia. Not on the topaz throne at the front of the regal tower of splendor sat Kull, but in the saddle, mounted on a great stallion, a true warrior king. His mighty arms swung up in reply to the salutes as the host passed. His fierce eyes passed the gorgeous trumpeters with casual glance, rested longer on the following soldiery, then blazed with a ferocious light as the Red Slayers halted in front of him with a clang of arms and a rearing of steeds, and tendered him the crowned salute. They narrowed slightly as the mercenaries strode by. They saluted no one, the mercenaries. They walked with shoulders flung back, eyeing Kull boldly and straightly, albeit with a certain appreciation. Fierce eyes, unblinking, savage eyes, staring from beneath shaggy manes and heavy brows. And Kull gave back a like stare. He granted much to brave men, and there were no braver in all the world, not even among the wild tribesmen who now disowned him. But Kull was too much the savage to have any great love for these. There were too many feuds. Many were age-old enemies of Kull's nation, and though the name of Kull was now a word accursed among the mountains and valleys of his people, and though Kull had put them from his mind, yet the old hates, the ancient passions still lingered. For Kull was no Valusian, but an Atlantean. The armies swung out of sight around the gem-blazing shoulders of the Tower of Splendor, and Kull reined his stallion about and started toward the palace at an easy gait, discussing the review with the commanders that rode with him, using not many words, but saying much. The army is like a sword, said Kull, and must not be allowed to rust. So down the street they rode, and Kull gave no heed to any of the whispers that reached his hearing from the throngs that still swarmed the streets. That is Kull, see, Valka. But what a king, and what a man! Look at his arms, his shoulders! And the undertones of the sinister whisperings. Kull, accused usurper from the pagan isles. Aye, shame to Valusia that a barbarian sits on the throne of kings. Little did Kull heed. Heavy-handed had he seized the decaying throne of ancient Valusia, and with heavier hand did he hold it, a man against a nation. After the council chamber, the social palace where Kull replied to the formal and laudatory phrases of the lords and ladies, with carefully hidden, grim amusement at such frivolities. Then the lords and ladies took their formal departure, and Kull leaned back upon the ermine throne and contemplated matters of state, until an attendant requested permission from the great king to speak, and announced an emissary from the Pictish embassy. Kull brought his mind back from the dim mazes of Valusian statecraft where it had been wandering, and gazed upon the Pict with little favor. The man gave back the gaze of the king without flinching. He was a lean, hipped, massive-chested warrior of middle height, dark, like all his race, and strongly built. From strong, immobile features gazed dauntless and inscrutable eyes. The chief of the counselors, Kanu of the tribe, right hand of the king of Pictum, sends greetings and says, "There is a throne at the feast of the rising moon for Kull, king of kings, lord of lords, emperor of Valusia." "Good," answered Kull. "Say to Kanu, the ancient ambassador of the Western Isles, that the king of Valusia will quaff wine with him when the moon floats over the hills of Zalgara." Still, the Pict lingered. "I have a word for the king, not," with a contemptuous flirt of his hands, "for these slaves." Kull dismissed the attendants with a word, watching the Pict warily. The man stepped nearer and lowered his voice. "Come alone to the feast tonight, Lord King. Such was the word of my chief." The king's eyes narrowed, gleaming like grey sword steel, coldly. "Alone?" "Aye." They eyed each other silently, their mutual tribal enmity seething beneath the cloak of formality. Their mouths spoke the cultured speech, the conventional court phrases of a highly polished race, a race not their own, but from their eyes gleamed the primal traditions of the elemental savage. Kull might be the king of Valusia, and the Pict might be an emissary to her courts, but there in the throne hall of kings, two tribesmen glowered at each other, fierce and wary, while ghosts of wild wars and world-ancient feuds whispered to each. To the king was the advantage as he enjoyed it to his fullest extent. Jaw resting on hand, he eyed the Pict, who stood like an image of bronze, head flung back, eyes unflinching. Across Kull's lips stole a smile that was more a sneer. "And so I am to come alone?" Civilization had taught him to speak by innuendo, and the Pict's dark eyes glittered, though he made no reply. "How am I to know that you come from Kanu?" "I have spoken," was the sullen response. "And when did a Pict speak truth?" sneered Kull, fully aware that the Picts never lied, but using this means to enrage the man. "I see your plan, king," the Pict answered, imperturbably. "You wish to anger me. By Valka, you need go no further. I am angry enough. And I challenge you to meet me in single battle, spear, sword or dagger, mounted or afoot." "Are you a king or a man?" Kull's eyes glinted with the grudging admiration a warrior must needs give a bold foeman, but he did not fail to use the chance of further annoying his antagonist. "A king does not accept the challenge of a nameless savage," he sneered, "nor does the emperor of Valusia break the truce of ambassadors. You have to leave to go." "Say to Kanu, I will come alone." The Pict's eyes flashed murderously. He fairly shook in the grasp of the primitive bloodlust. Then, turning his back squarely upon the king of Valusia, he strode across the hall of society and vanished through the great door. Again, Kull leaned back upon the ermine throne and meditated. So the chief of the Council of Picts wished him to come alone. For what reason? Treachery? Grimly, Kull touched the hilt of his great sword, but scarcely. The Picts valued too greatly the alliance with Valusia to break it for any feudal reason. Kull might be a warrior of Atlantis and hereditary enemy of all Picts, but too, he was a king of Valusia, the most potent ally of the men of the West. Kull reflected long upon the strange state of affairs that made him an ally of ancient foes and foe of ancient friends. He rose and paced restlessly across the hall with the quick, noiseless tread of a lion. Chains of friendship, tribe, and tradition had he broken to satisfy his ambition, and, by Valka, god of the sea and the land, he had realized that ambition. He was king of Valusia, a fading, degenerate Valusia, a Valusia living mostly in the dreams of bygone glory, but still a mighty land and the greatest of the 7 empires. Valusia, land of dreams, the tribesmen named it, and sometimes it seemed to Kull that he moved in a dream. Strange to him were the intrigues of court and palace, army and people. All was like a masquerade where men and women hid their real thoughts with a smooth mask. Yet, the seizing of the throne had been easy, a bold snatching of opportunity, the swift whirl of swords, the slaying of a tyrant of whom men had wearied unto death. Short, crafty plotting with ambitious statesmen out of favor at court, and Kull, wandering adventure, Atlantean exile, had swept up to the dizzying heights of his dreams. He was Lord of Valusia, King of Kings. Yet now it seemed that the seizing was far easier than the keeping. The sight of the pick had brought back youthful associations to his mind, the free, wild savagery of his boyhood. And now a strange feeling of dim unrest, of unreality, stole over him as of late it had been doing. Who was he, a straightforward man of the seas and the mountain, to rule a race strangely and terribly wise with the mysticisms of antiquity? An ancient race. "I am Kull," said he, flinging back his head as a lion flings back his mane. "I am Kull!" His falcon gaze swept upon the ancient hall. His self-confidence flowed back. And in a dim nook of the hall, the tapestry moved slightly. 2. Thus spake the silent halls of Valusia. The moon had not risen, and the garden was lighted with torches aglow and silver cressets when Kull sat down in the throne before the table of Kanu, ambassador of the Western Isles. At his right hand sat the ancient Pict, as much unlike an emissary of that fierce race as a man could be. Ancient was Kanu, and wise in statecraft, grown old in the game. There was no elemental hatred in the eyes that looked at Kull appraisingly, no tribal traditions hindering his judgments. Long associations with the statesmen of the civilized nations had swept away such cobwebs. Not, "Who and what is this man?" was a question ever foremost in Kanu's mind, but, "Can I use this man, and how?" Tribal prejudices he used only to further his own schemes. And Kull watched Kanu, answering his conversation briefly, wondering if civilization would make of him a thing like the Pict. For Kanu was soft and paunchy. Many years had stridden across the sky rim since Kanu had wielded a sword. True, he was old, but Kull had seen men older than he in the forefront of the battle. Picts were a long-lived race. A beautiful girl stood at Kanu's elbow, refilling his goblet, and she was kept busy. Meanwhile, Kanu kept up a running fire of jests and comments, and Kull, secretly contemptuous of his garrulity, nevertheless missed none of his shrewd humor. At the banquet were Pictish chiefs and statesmen, the later jovial and easy in their manner, the warriors formerly courteous, but plainly hampered by their tribal affinities. Yet Kull, with a tinge of envy, was cognizant of the freedom and ease of the affairs as contrasted with the like affairs of the Valusian court. Such freedom prevailed in the rude camps of Atlantis. Kull shrugged his shoulders. After all, doubtless Kanu, who had seemed to have forgotten he was a Pict as far as time-hoary custom and prejudice went, was right, and he, Kull, would better become a Valusian in mind as in name. At last, when the moon had reached her zenith, Kanu, having eaten and drunk as much as any 3 men there, leaned back upon his divan with a comfortable sigh and said, "Now, get you gone, friends, for the king and I would converse on such matters as concerns not children." "Yes, you too, my pretty. Yet, first let me kiss those ruby lips. So, now dance away, my rosebloom." Kanu's eyes twinkled above his white beard as he surveyed Kull, who sat erect, grim and uncompromising. "You are thinking, Kull," said the old statesman suddenly, "that Kanu is a useless old reprobate, fit for nothing except to guzzle wine and kiss wenches." In fact, this remark was so much in line with his actual thoughts and so plainly put that Kull was rather startled, though he gave no sign. Kanu gurgled and his paunch shook with his mirth. Wine is red and women are soft, he remarked tolerantly. But ha! Think not old Canu allows either to interfere with business. Again he laughed, and Kull moved restlessly. This seemed much like being made sport of, and the king's scintillant eyes began to glow with a feline light. Canu reached for the wine pitcher, filled his beaker, and glanced questioningly at Kull, who shook his head irritably. Aye, said Canu equably. It takes an old head to stand strong drink. I am growing old, Kull, so why should you young men begrudge me such pleasures as we oldsters must find? Ah me, I grow ancient and withered, friendless and cheerless. But his looks and expressions failed far from bearing out his words. His rubicund countenance fairly glowed, and his eyes sparkled, so that his white beard seemed incongruous. Indeed, he looked remarkably elfin, reflected Kull, who felt vaguely resentful. The old scoundrel had lost all of the primitive virtues of his race and of Kull's race, yet he seemed more pleased in his aged days than otherwise. Hark ye, Kull, said Canu, raising an admonitory finger. 'Tis a chance thing to laud a young man, yet I must speak my true thoughts to gain your confidence. If you think to gain it by flattery— Tush! Who spoke of flattery? I flatter only to discard. There was a keen sparkle in Canu's eyes, a cold glimmer that did not match his lazy smile. He knew men, and he knew that to gain his end he must smite straight with this tigerish barbarian, who, like a wolf scenting a snare, would scent out unerringly any falseness in the skein of his word web. You have power, Kull, said he, using his words with more care than he did in the council rooms of the nation, to make yourself mightiest of all kings and restore some of the lost glories of Valusia. So I care little for Valusia, though the women and wine be excellent, save for the fact that the stronger Valusia is, the stronger is the picked nation. More, with an Atlantean on the throne, eventually Atlantis will become united. Kull laughed in harsh mockery. Canu touched an old wound. Atlantis made my name accursed when I went to seek fame and fortune among the cities of the world. They are age-old foes of the seven empires, greater foes of the allies of the empires, as you should know. Canu tugged his beard and smiled enigmatically. Nay, let it pass, but I know whereof I speak. And then warfare will cease, wherein there is no gain. I see a world of peace and prosperity, man loving his fellow man, good supreme. All this can you accomplish, if you live. Huh! Kull's lean hand closed on his hilt, and he half rose with a sudden movement of such dynamic speed that Canu, who fancied men as some men fancy blooded horses, felt his old blood leap with a sudden thrill. Valka, what a warrior! Nerves of sinews of steel and fire bound together with a perfect coordination. Fighting instinct makes the terrible warrior. But none of Canu's enthusiasm showed in his mildly sarcastic tone. Tush! Be seated. Look about you. The gardens are deserted, the seats are empty save for ourselves. You fear not me? Kull sank back, gazing about him waringly. There speaks of savages, mused Canu. Think you if I planned treachery I would have enacted it here where suspicion would be sure to fall upon me? Tut! You young tribesmen have much to learn. There were my chiefs who were not at ease because you were born among the hills of Atlantis, and you despise me in your secret mind because I am a Pict. Tush! I see you as Kull, king of Valusia, not as Kull the reckless Atlantean, leader of the raiders who harried the Western Isles. So you should see in me not a Pict, but an international man, a figure of the world. Now to that figure, hark! If you were slain tomorrow, who would be king? Canu, Baron of Balal. Even so, I object to Canu for many reasons, yet most of all for the fact that he is but a figurehead. How so? He was my greatest opponent, but I did not know that he was championed any cause but his own. The knight can hear, answered Canu obliquely. There are worlds within worlds, but you may trust me and you may trust Brule, the spear slayer. Look, He drew from his robes a bracelet of gold representing a winged dragon coiled thrice with 3 horns of a ruby on the head. Examine it closely. Brule will wear it on his arm when he comes to you tomorrow night, so that you may know him. Trust Brule as you trust yourself, and do what he tells you to. And in proof of trust, look ye. And with the speed of a striking hawk, the ancient snatched something from his robes, something that flung a weird green light over them, and which he replaced in an instant. "The stolen gem!" exclaimed Kull, recoiling. "Green jewel of the Temple of the Serpent." "Valka, you! And why do you show it to me?" "To save your life, prove my trust. If I betray your trust, deal with me likewise. You hold my life in your hand. Now I could not be false to you if I would, for a word from you would be my doom." Yet for all his words, the old scoundrel beamed merrily and seemed vastly pleased with himself. "But why do you give me this to hold over you?" asked Kull, becoming more bewildered each second. "As I told you. Now, you see that I do not intend to deal you false, and tomorrow night when Brule comes to you, you will follow his advice without fear of treachery. Enough. An escort awaits outside to ride to the palace with you, Lord." Kull rose. "But you have told me nothing. Tush, how impatient are you!" Kanu looked more like a mischievous elf than ever. "Go you and dream of thrones and power and kingdoms, while I dream of wine and soft women and roses. And fortune ride with you, King Kull." As he left the garden, Kull glanced back to see Kanu, still reclining lazily in his seat, a merry ancient, beaming on all the world with jovial fellowship. A mounted warrior waited for the king just without the garden, and Kull was slightly surprised to see that it was the same that had brought Kanu's invitation. No word was spoken as Kull swung into the saddle, nor as they clattered along the empty streets. The color and the gaiety of the day had given way to the eerie stillness of the night. The city's antiquity was more than ever apparent beneath the bent silver moon. The huge pillars of the mansions and palaces towered up into the stars. The broad stairways, silent and deserted, seemed to climb endlessly until they vanished into the shadowy darkness of the upper realms. Stairs to the stars, thought Kull, his imaginative mind inspired by the weird grandeur of the scene. Clang, clang, clang sounded the silver hooves on the broad, moon-flooded streets, but otherwise there was no sound. The age of the city, its incredible antiquity, was almost oppressive to the king. It was as if the great silent buildings laughed at him, noiselessly, with unguessable mockery. And what secrets did they hold? "You are young," said the palaces and the old temples and the shrines, "but we are old. The world was wild with youth when we were reared. You and your tribe shall pass, but we are invincible, indestructible. We towered above a strange world ere Atlantis and Lemuria rose from the sea. We still shall reign when the green waters sigh for many a restless fathom above the spires of Lemuria and the hills of Atlantis, and when the isles of the western men are the mountains of a strange land." How many kings have we watched ride down these streets before Kull of Atlantis was even a dream in the mind of Ka, bird of creation? Ride on, Kull of Atlantis. Greater shall follow you. Greater came before you. They are dust. They are forgotten. We stand. We know. We are. Ride. Ride on, Kull of Atlantis. Kull the king. Kull the fool. And it seemed to Kull that the clashing hooves took up the silent refrain to beat it into the night with hollow re-echoing mockery. Kull the king. Kull the fool. Glow moon, you light a king's way. Gleam stars, your torches in the train of an emperor. And clang, silver-shod hooves, you herald that Kull rides through Valusia. Ho! Awake, Valusia! It is Kull that rides, Kull the king! We have known many kings, said the silent halls of Valusia. And so in a brooding mood, Kull came to the palace, where his bodyguard, men of the Red Slayers, came to take the reins of his great stallion and escort Kull to the rest. There, the Pict, still suddenly speechless, wheeled his steed with a savage wrench of the rein and fled away into the dark like a phantom. Kull's heightened imagination pictured him speeding through the silent streets like a goblin out of the Elder World. There was no sleep for Kull that night, for it was nearly dawn, and he spent the rest of the night hours pacing the throne room, and pondering over what had passed. Kanu had told him nothing, yet he had put himself in Kull's complete power. And what he had hinted when he had said that Baron of Balal was naught but a figurehead. And who was this Brule who was to come to him by night, wearing the mystic armlet of the dragon? And why, above all, why had Kanu showed him the green gem of terror, stolen long ago from the Temple of the Serpent, for which the world would rock in wars were it known to the weird and terrible keepers of that temple, and from whose vengeance not even Kanu's ferocious tribesmen might be able to save him? But Kanu knew he was safe, reflected Kull, for the statesman was too shrewd to expose himself to risk without profit. But was it to throw the king off his guard and pave the way for treachery? Would Kanu dare let him live now? Kull shrugged his shoulders. 3. They that walk the night. The moon had not risen when Kull, hand to hilt, stepped to a window. The windows opened upon the great inner gardens of the royal palaces, and the breezes of the night, bearing the scents of spice trees, blew the filmy curtains about. The king looked out. The walks and groves were deserted. Carefully trimmed trees were bulky shadows. Fountains nearby flung their slender sheen of silver into the starlight, and distant fountains rippled steadily. No guards walked these gardens, for so closely were the outer walls guarded that it seemed impossible for any invader to gain access to them. Vines curled up the walls of the palace, and even as Kull mused upon the ease with which they might be climbed, a segment of shadow detached itself from the darkness below the window, and a bare, brown arm curved up over the sill. Kull's great sword hissed halfway from the sheath. Then the king halted. Upon the muscular forearm gleamed the dragon amulet shown him by Kanu the night before. The possessor of the arm pulled himself up over the sill and into the room with the swift, easy motion of a climbing leopard. "You are Brule?" asked Kull, and then stopped in surprise not unmingled with annoyance and suspicion. For the man was he whom Kull had taunted in the hall of society, the same who had escorted him from the Pictish embassy. "I am Brule the Spear-Slayer," answered the Pict in a guarded voice. Then swiftly, gazing closely in Kull's face, he said, barely above a whisper, "Kanama ka la Germa." Kull started. "Ha? What mean you? Know you not?" "Nay, the words are unfamiliar. They are of no language I have ever heard, and yet, by Valka, somewhere I have heard." "Aye," was the Pict's only comment. His eyes swept the room, the study room of the palace. Except for a few tables, a divan or two, and great shelves of books and parchment, the room was barren compared to the grandeur of the rest of the palace. "Tell me, king, who guards the door?" 18 of the Red Slayers." "But how come you stealing through the gardens by night and scaling the walls of the palace?" Brule sneered. "The guards of Valusia are blind buffaloes. I could steal their girls from under their noses. I stole amid them, and they saw me not, nor heard me. And the walls, I could scale them without the aid of vines. I have hunted tigers on the foggy beaches when the sharp east breezes blew the mist in from seaward, and I have climbed the steeps of the western sea mountains. But come, nay, touch this amulet." He held out his arm, and, as Kull complied wonderingly, gave an apparent sigh of relief. "So, now throw off those kingly robes, for there are ahead of you this night such deeds as no Atlantean ever dreamed of." Brule himself was clad only in a scanty loincloth through which was thrust a short, curved sword. "And who are you to give me orders?" asked Kull, slightly resentful. "Did not Kanu bid you follow me in all things?" asked the Pit irritably, his eyes flashing momentarily. "I have no love for you, lord, but for the moment I have put the thought of feuds from my mind. Do you likewise, but come." Walking noiselessly, he led the way across the room to the door. A slide in the door allowed a view of the outer corridor, unseen from without, and the Pict bade Kull look. "What do you see?" "Naught but the 18 guardsmen." The Pict nodded, motioned Kull to follow him across the room. At a panel in the opposite wall, Brule stopped and fumbled there for a moment. Then, with a light movement, he stepped back, drawing his sword as he did so. Kull gave an exclamation as the panel swung silently open, revealing a dimly lighted passageway. A secret passage, swore Kull softly, and I knew nothing of it. By Valka, someone shall dance for this. Silence, hissed Pick. Brule was standing like a bronze statue, as if straining every nerve for the slightest sound. Something about his attitude made Kull's hair prickle slightly, not from fear, but from some eerie anticipation. Then, beckoning, Brule stepped through the secret doorway which stood open behind them. The passage was bare, but not dust-covered as should have been the case with an unused secret corridor. A vague, gray light filtered through somewhere, but the source of it was not apparent. Every few feet Kull saw doors, invisible as he knew from the outside, but easily apparent from within. The palace is a veritable honeycomb, he muttered. Aye, night and day you are watched, King, by many eyes. The king was impressed by Brule's manner. The Pict went forward slowly, warily, half crouching, blade held low and thrust forward. When he spoke, it was in a whisper, and he was continually flung glances from side to side. The corridor turned sharply, and Brule warily gazed past the turn. Look, he whispered, but remember, no word, no sound, on your life. Kull cautiously gazed past him. The corridor changed just at the bend to a flight of steps, and then Kull recoiled. At the foot of the stairs lay the 18 Red Slayers who were that night stationed to watch the king's study room. Brule's grip upon his mighty arm and Brule's fierce whisper at his shoulder alone kept Kull from leaping down the stairs. Silent, Kull. Silent in Valka's name, hissed the Pict. These corridors are empty now, but I risk much in showing you. You might then believe what I had to say. Back now to the room of study, and he retraced his steps, Kull following, his mind in a turmoil of bewilderment. This is treachery, muttered the king, his steel-gray eyes a-smolder, foul and swift. Mere minutes have passed since those men stood guard. Again, in the room of the study, Brule carefully closed the secret panel and motioned Kull to look again through the slit of the outer door. Kull grasped audibly. For without stood the 18 guardsmen. This is sorcery, he whispered, half drawing his sword. Do dead men guard the king? Aye, came Brule's scarcely audible reply. There was a strange expression in the Pict's scintillant eyes. They looked squarely into each other's eyes for an instant. Kull's brow wrinkled in a puzzled scowl as he strove to read the Pict's inscrutable face. Then Brule's lips, barely moving, formed the words, "The snake that speaks." Silent, whispered Kull, laying his hand over Brule's mouth. That is death to speak. That is a name accursed. The Pict's fearless eyes regarded him steadily. Look again, King Kull. Perchance the guard was changed. Nay, those are the same men. In Valka's name, this is sorcery. This is insanity. I saw with my own eyes the bodies of those men not 8 minutes agone. And yet there they stand. Brule stepped back, away from the door, Kull mechanically following. Kull, what know ye of the traditions of this race ye rule? Much, and yet little. Valusia is so old. Aye, Brule's eyes lighted strangely. We are but barbarians, infants compared to the 7 empires. Not even they themselves know how old they are. Neither the memory of men nor annals of the historians reach back far enough to tell us when the first men came up from the sea and built the cities on the shore. But Kull, men were not always ruled by men. The king started. Their eyes met. Aye, there is a legend of my people. And mine, broke in Brule. That was before we were of the isles we were allied with Valusia. Aye, in the region of Lionfang, 7th war chief of the Picts, so many years ago no man remembers how many. Across the sea we came, from the Isles of the Sunset, skirting the shores of Atlantis, and falling upon the beaches of Valusia with fire and sword. Aye, the long white beaches resounded with the clash of spears, and the night was like a day from the flame of the burning castles. And the king of Valusia, who died on the Red Sea sands that dim day, his voice trailed off. The two stared at each other, neither speaking, then each nodded. Ancient is Valusia, whispered Kull. The hills of Atlantis and Mu were isles of the sea when Valusia was young. The night breeze whispered through the open window. Not the free, crisp sea air, such as Brule and Kull knew and reveled in their land, but a breath like a whisper from the past, laden with musk, scents of forgotten things, breathing secrets that were hoary when the world was young. The tapestries rustled, and suddenly Kull felt like a naked child before the inscrutable wisdom of a mystic past. Again, the sense of unreality swept upon him. At the back of his soul stole dim, gigantic phantoms, whispering monstrous things. He sensed that Brule experienced similar thoughts. The Pick's eyes were fixed upon his face with a fierce intensity. Their glances met. Kull felt warmly a sense of comradeship with this member of an enemy tribe. Like rival leopards turning at bay against hunters, these two savages made common cause against the inhuman powers of antiquity. Brule again led the way back to the secret door. Silently they entered, and silently they proceeded down the dim corridor, taking the opposite direction from that in which they had previously traversed it. After a while, the Pick stopped and pressed close to one of the secret doors, bidding Kull look with him through the hidden slot. This opens upon a little used stair which leads to a corridor running past the study room door. Gazed, and presently mounting the stairs silently came a silent shape. "To, Chief Counselor," exclaimed Kull, "by night, and with bared dagger." "How? What means this, Brule?" "Murder, and foulest treachery," hissed Brule. "Nay," as Kull would have flung the door aside and leapt forth, "we are lost if you meet him here, for more lurk at the foot of those stairs. Come." Half running, they darted back along the passage. Back through the secret door Brule led, shutting it carefully behind them, then across the chamber to an opening into a room seldom used. There he swept aside some tapestries in a dim corner nook and, drawing Kull with him, stepped behind them. Minutes dragged. Kull could hear the breeze in the other room blowing the window curtains about, and it seemed to him like the murmur of ghosts. Then, through the door, stealthily came To, Chief Counselor of the King. Evidently, he had come through the study room, and finding it empty, sought his victim where he was most likely to be. He came with upraised dagger, walking silently. A moment he halted, gazing around the apparently empty room, which was lighted dimly by a single candle. Then he advanced cautiously, apparently at a loss to understand the absence of the king. He stood before the hiding place and, "Slay!" hissed the Pick. Kull, with a single mighty leap, hurled himself into the room. To spun, but the blinding tigerish speed of the attack gave him no chance for defense or counterattack. Sword steel flashed in the dim light and grated on bone as To toppled backwards, Kull's sword standing out between his shoulders. Kull leaned above him, teeth bared in the killer's snarl, heavy brows a scowl, above eyes that were like gray ice of the cold sea. Then he released the hilt and recoiled, shaken, dizzy, the hand of death at his spine. For as he watched, Tu's face became strangely dim and unreal. The features mingled and merged in a seemingly impossible manner. Then, like a fading mask of fog, the face suddenly vanished, and in its stead gaped and leered a monstrous serpent's head. "Valka!" gasped Kull, sweat beading his forehead again and again. "Valka!" Brule leaned forward, face immobile. Yet his glittering eyes mirrored something of Kull's horror. "Regain your sword, Lord King," said he. "There are yet deeds to be done." Hesitantly, Kull set his hand to the hilt. His flesh crawled as he set his foot upon the terror which lay at their feet, and as some jerk of muscular reaction caused the frightful mouth to gape suddenly, he recoiled, weak with nausea. Then, wrathful at himself, he plucked forth his sword and gazed more closely at the nameless thing that he had known as To, Chief Counselor. Save for the reptilian head, the thing was the exact counterpart of a man. "A man with the head of a snake," Kull murmured. "This, then, is a priest of the serpent god?" "Aye. To sleeps unknowing. These fiends can take any form they will. That is, they can, by a magic charm or their like, fling a web of sorcery about their faces as an actor dons a mask, so that they resemble anyone they wish to." "Then the old legends were true," mused the king. The grim old tales few dare even whisper, lest they die as blasphemers, are no fantasies. By Valka, I had thought, I had guessed, but it seems beyond the bounds of reality. Ha! Guardsmen outside the door. They too are snake men. Hold. What would you do? Slay them, said Kull between his teeth. Strike at the skull, if at all, said Brule. 18 wait without the door, and perhaps a score more in the corridors. Hark ye, king, Kanu learned of this plot. His spies have pierced the innermost fastness of the snake priestess, and they brought hints of a plot. Long ago he discovered the secret passageways of the palace, and at his command I studied the map thereof, and came here by night to aid you, lest you die as other kings of Valusia have died. I came alone for the reason that to send more would have roused suspicion. Many could not steal into the palace as I did. Some of them foul conspiracy. You have seen. Snake men guard your door, and that one, as two, could pass anywhere else in the palace in the morning. If the priest failed, the real guards would be holding their places again. Nothing knowing, nothing remembering. There to take the blame if the priest succeeded. But stay you here while I dispose of this carrion. So saying, the Pict shouldered the frightful thing stolidly and vanished with it through another secret panel. Kull stood alone, his mind a whirl. Neophytes of the mighty serpent, how many lurked among the cities? How might he tell the false from the true? Aye, how many of his trusted counselors, his generals, were men? He could be certain of whom? The secret panel swung inward, and Brule entered. You were swift. Aye, the warrior stepped forward, eyeing the floor. There's gore upon the rug, see? Kull bent forward from the corner of his eye. He saw a blur of moment, a glint of steel. Like a loosened bow he whipped erect, thrusting forward. The warrior sagged upon the sword, his own clattering to the floor. Even at that instant, Kull reflected grimly that it was inappropriate that the traitor should meet his death upon the sliding upward thrust used by so much his race. Then, as Brule slid from the sword to sprawl motionless on the floor, the face began to merge and fade, and as Kull caught his breath, his hair prickled, the human features vanished, and there the jaws of a great snake gaped hideously, terrible beady eyes venomous even in death. He was a snake priest all the time, gasped the king. Valka, what an elaborate plan to throw me off my guard. Kanu there, is he a man? Was it Kanu to whom I talked in the gardens? Almighty Valka! As his flesh crawled with a horrid thought, are the people of Valusia men, or are they all serpents? Undecided, he stood, idly seeing that the thing named Brule no longer wore the dragon amulet. The sound made him wheel. Brule was coming through the secret door. Hold! Upon the arm upthrown to halt the king's hovering sword gleamed the dragon armlet. Valka! The Pict stopped short. Then a grim smile curled his lips. By the god of the seas, these demons are crafty past reckoning. For it must be that the one lurked in the corridors, and seeing me go carrying the carcass of the other, took my appearance. So, I have another to do away with. Hold. There was a menace of death in Kull's voice. I have seen two men turn to serpents before my eyes. How may I know if you are a true man? Brule laughed. For 2 reasons, King Kull. No snake man wears this, he indicated the dragon armlet. Nor can any say these words, and again Kull heard the strange phrase, Ka nama ka la jama. Ka nama ka la jama, Kull repeated mechanically. Now where in Valka's name have I heard that? I have not, and yet. Aye, you remember, Kull, said Brule. Through the dim corridors of memory those words lurk, though you never heard them in this life. Yet in this bygone age, they were so terribly impressed upon the soul mind that never dies, that they will always strike dim chords in your memory, though you be reincarnated for 1,000,000 years to come. For that phrase has come secretly down the grim and bloody eons, since when, uncounted centuries ago, those words were watchwords for the race of men who battled with the grisly beings of the elder universe. For none but a real man of men may speak them, whose jaws and mouths are shaped different from any other creature. Their meaning has been forgotten, but not the words themselves. True, said Kull. I remember the legends. Volca! He stopped short, staring, for suddenly, like the silent swinging wide of a mystic door, misty, unfathomed reaches opened in the recesses of his consciousness, and for an instant he seemed to gaze back through the vastness that spanned life and life, seeing through the vague and ghostly fogs, dim shapes, reliving dead centuries, men in combat with hideous monsters, vanquishing a planet of frightful terrors. Against a gray, ever-shifting background moved strange nightmare forms, fantasies of lunacy and fear, and a man, the jest of the gods, the blind, wisdomless striver from dust to dust, following the long, bloody trail of his destiny, knowing not why, bestial, blundering, like a great murderous child, yet feeling somewhere a spark of divine fire. Kull drew a hand across his brow, shaken. These sudden glimpses into the abysses of memory always startled him. They are gone, said Brule, as if scanning his secret mind. The bird woman, the harpies, the batmen, the flying fiends, the wolf people, the demons, the goblins. All, save as this being that lies at our feet, and a few of the wolfmen. Long and terrible was the war, lasting through the bloody centuries, since the first men, risen from the mire of apedom, turned upon those who then ruled the world. And, at last, mankind conquered, so long ago that naught but dim legends come to us through the ages. The snake people were the last to go, yet at last men conquered even them and drove them forth into the wastelands of the world, there to mate with true snakes until some day, say the sages, the horrid breed shall vanish utterly. Yet the things returned in crafty guise as men grew soft and degenerate, forgetting ancient wars. Ah, that was a grim and secret war. Among the men of the younger earth stole the frightful monsters of the elder planet, safeguarded by their horrid wisdom and mysticisms, taking all forms and shapes, doing deeds of horror secretly. No man knew who was true man and who false. No man could trust any man. Yet by means of their own craft they formed ways by which the false might be known from the true. Men took for a sign and a standard the figure of the flying dragon, the winged dinosaur, a monster of past ages, which was the greatest foe of the serpent. And men used those symbols which I spoke to you as a sign and a symbol, for as I said, none but a true man can repeat them. So mankind triumphed. Yet again the fiends came after the years of forgetfulness had gone by, for man is still an ape in that he forgets what is not ever before his eyes. As priests they came, and for that men in their luxury and might had by then lost faith in the old religions and worships. The snake men, in the guise of teachers of a new and truer cult, built a monstrous religion about the worship of the serpent god. Such is their power, that it is now to death to repeat the old legends of the snake people, and people bow again to the serpent god in the new form, and blind fools that they are, the great hosts of men see no connection between this power and the power men overthrew eons ago. As priests, the snake men are content to rule, and yet... He stopped. Go on. Kull felt an unaccountable stirring of the short hair at the base of his scalp. Kings have reigned as true men in Valusia, the Pict whispered, and yet, slain in battle, have died serpents, as died he who fell beneath the spear of Lion Fang, on the red beaches when we of the Isles harried the 7 empires. And how can this be, Lord Kull? These kings were born of women and lived as men. The true kings, died in secret, as you would have died tonight, and priests of the serpent reigned in their stead, no man knowing. Kull cursed between his teeth. Aye, it must be. No one has ever seen a priest of the serpent and lived. That is known. They live in utmost secrecy. The statecraft of the 7 empires is a mazy, monstrous thing, said Brule. There the true men know that among them glide the spies of the serpent, and the men who are the serpent's allies, such as Canub, Baron of Balal, Yet no man dares seek to unmask a suspect, lest vengeance befall him. No man trusts his fellow, and the true statesmen dare not speak to each other what is in the minds of all. Could they be sure? Could a snake man or plot be unmasked before them all? Then would the power of the serpent be more than half broken, for all would then ally to make common cause, sifting out the traitors. Kanu alone is of sufficient shrewdness and courage to cope with them. And even Kanu learned only enough of the plot to tell me what would happen, what is supposed to happen up to this time. Thus far I was prepared. From now on we must trust our luck and our craft. Here and now I think we are safe. Those snake men without the door dare not leave their post lest true men come here unexpectedly. But tomorrow they will try something else, you may be sure. Just what they will do, none can say, not even Kanu. But we must stay at each other's sides, King Kull, until we conquer or both be dead. Now come with me while I take this carcass to the hiding place where I took the other being. Kull followed the Pict with his grisly burden through the secret panel and down the dim corridor. Their feet, trained to the silence of the wilderness, made no noise. Like phantoms they glided through the ghostly light, Kull wondering that the corridor should be deserted. At every turn he expected to run full upon some frightful apparition. Suspicion surged back upon him. Was this Pict leading him into ambush? He fell back a pace or two behind Brule, his ready sword hovering at the Pict's unheeding back. Brule should die first if he met treachery. But if the Pict was aware of the king's suspicion, he showed no sign. Stolidly he tramped along until they came to a room, dusty and long unused, where moldy tapestries hung heavy. Brule drew aside some of these and concealed the corpse behind them. Then they turned to retrace their steps, when suddenly Brule halted with such abruptness that he was closer to death than he knew, for Kull's nerves were on edge. Something moving in the corridor, hissed the Pict. Kanu said these ways would be empty, yet he drew his sword and stole into the corridor, Kull following warily. A short way down the corridor, a strange, vague glow appeared that came toward them. Nerves aleap, they waited, backs to the corridor wall, for what they knew not. But Kull heard Brule's breath hiss through his teeth, and was reassured of Brule's loyalty. The glow merged into a shadowy form. Of shape, vaguely like a man it was, but misty and elusive, like a wisp of fog that grew more tangible as it approached, but never fully material. A face looked at them, a pair of luminous great eyes that seemed to hold all the tortures of 1,000,000 centuries. There was no menace in that face with its dim, worn features, but only a great pity. And that face. Almighty gods, breathed Kull, an icy hand at his soul. Ilal, king of Valusia, who died 1,000 years ago. Brule shrank back as far as he could, his narrow eyes widened in a blaze of pure horror, the sword shaking in his grip, unnerved for the first time that weird night. Erect and defiant stood Kull, instinctively holding his useless sword at the ready, flesh a crawl, hair a prickle, yet still a king of kings, as ready to challenge the powers of the unknown dead as the powers of the living. The phantom came straight on, giving them no heed. Kull shrank back as it passed them, feeling an icy breath like a breeze from the Arctic snow. Straight on went the shape with slow, silent footsteps, as if the chains of all the ages were upon those vague feet, vanishing about a bend in the corridor. Valka, muttered the Pict, wiping the cold beads from his brow. That was no man. That was a ghost. Aye, Kull shook his head wonderingly. Did you not recognize the face? That was Ilal, who reigned in Valusia 1,000 years ago and who was found hideously murdered in his throne room, the room now known as the Accursed Room. Have you not seen his statue in the Fame Room of Kings? Yes, I remember the tale now. Gods, Kull. That is another sign of the frightful and foul power of the snake priests. That king was slain by snake people, and thus his soul became their slave to do their bidding throughout eternity. For the sages have ever maintained that if a man is slain by a snake man, his ghost becomes their slave. A shudder shook Kull's gigantic frame. Valka, what a fate. Hark ye. His fingers closed upon Brul's sinewy arm like steel. "Hark ye. If I am wounded unto death by these foul monsters, swear that ye will smite your sword through my breast, lest my soul be enslaved." "I swear," answered Brul, his fierce eyes lighting. "And do ye the same to me, Kull." Their strong right hands met in a silent sealing of their bloody bargain. 4. Masks. Kull sat upon his throne and gazed broodingly out upon the sea of faces turned toward him. The courtier was speaking in evenly modulated tones, but the king scarcely heard him. Close by, two chief counselors stood ready at Kull's command, and each time the king looked at him, Kull shuddered inwardly. The surface of court life was as the unrippled surface of the sea between tide and tide. To the musing king, the affairs of the night before seemed as a dream, until his eyes dropped to the arm of his throne. A brown, sinewy hand rested there, upon the wrist of which gleamed a dragon amulet. Brul stood beside his throne, and ever the Pict's fierce secret whisper brought him back from the realm of unreality in which he moved. No, that was no dream, that monstrous interlude. As he sat upon his throne in the hall of society and gazed upon the courtiers, the ladies, the lords, the statesmen, he seemed to see their faces as things of illusion, things unreal, existent only as shadows and mockeries of substance. Always he had seen their faces as masks, but before he had looked on them with contemptuous tolerance, thinking to see beneath the mask shallow, puny souls, avaricious, lustful, deceitful. Now there was a grim undertone, a sinister meaning, a vague horror that lurked beneath the smooth masks. While he exchanged courtesies with some nobleman or counselor, he seemed to see the smiling face fade like smoke, and the frightful jaws of a serpent gaping there. How many of those he looked upon were horrid, inhuman monsters, plotting his death, beneath the smooth, mesmeric illusion of a human face. Valusia, land of dreams and nightmares, a kingdom of shadows, ruled by phantoms who glided back and forth behind the painted curtains, mocking the futile king who sat upon the throne, himself a shadow. And like a comrade, Shadow Brul stood by his side, dark eyes glittering from immobile face. A real man, Brul, and Kull felt his friendship for the savage became a thing of reality, and sensed that Brul felt a friendship for him beyond the mere necessity of statecraft. And what, mused Kull, were the realities of life? Ambition, power, pride, the friendship of man, the love of women, which Kull had never known. Battle, plunder, what? The Kull who sat upon the throne, or was it the real Kull who had scaled the hills of Atlantis, harried the far isles of the sunset, and laughed upon the green roaring tides of the Atlantean Sea? How could a man be so many different men in a lifetime? For Kull knew that there were many Kulls, and he wondered which was the real Kull. After all, the priests of the serpent merely went a step farther in their magic. For all men wore a mask, and many a different mask with each different man or woman, and Kull wondered if a serpent did not lurk under every mask. So he sat and brooded in strange, mazy thought ways, and the courtiers came and went, and the minor affairs of the day were completed, until at last the king and Brul sat alone in the hall of society, save for the drowsy attendants. Kull felt a weariness. Neither he nor Brul had slept the night before, nor had Kull slept the night before that, when, in the gardens of Kanu, he had had his first hint of the weird things to be. Last night nothing further had occurred after they had returned to the study room from the secret corridors, but they had neither dared nor cared to sleep. Kull, with the incredible vitality of a wolf, had aforetime gone for days upon days without sleep, in his wild, savage days, but now his mind was edged from constant thinking, and from the nerve-breaking eeriness of the past night. He needed sleep, but sleep was furthest from his mind, and he would not have dared sleep if he had thought of it. Another thing that had shaken him was the fact that though he and Brul had kept a close watch to see if, or when, the study room guard was changed, yet it was changed without their knowledge. For the next morning, those who stood on guard were able to repeat the magic words of Brul, but they remembered nothing out of the ordinary. They thought that they had stood at guard all night, as usual, and Kull said nothing to the contrary. He believed the true men, but Brule had advised absolute secrecy, and Kull also thought it best. Now Brule leaned over the throne, lowering his voice so not even the lazy attendant could hear. "They will strike soon, I think, Kull. A while ago, Kanu gave me a secret sign. The priests know that we know of their plot, of course, but they know not how much we know. We must be ready for any sort of action. Kanu and the Pictish chiefs will remain within hailing distance now until this is settled one way or another. Ha, Kull, if it comes to a pitched battle, the streets and the castles of Valusia will run red." Kull smiled grimly. He would greet any sort of action with a ferocious joy. This wandering in a labyrinth of illusion and magic was extremely irksome to his nature. He longed for the leap and clang of swords, the joyous freedom of battle. Then, into the hall of society came two again, and the rest of the counselors. "Lord King, the hour of council is at hand, and we stand ready to escort you to the council room." Kull rose, and the counselors bent the knee as he passed through the way opened by them for his passage, rising behind him and following. Eyebrows were raised as the Pict strode defiantly beside the king. No one dissented. Brule's challenging gaze swept the smooth faces of the counselors with their defiance of an intruding savage. The group passed through the halls and came at last to the council chamber. The door was closed, as usual, and the counselors arranged themselves in the order of their rank before the dais upon which stood the king. Like a bronze statue, Brule took up his stand behind Kull. Kull swept the room with a swift stare. Surely no chance of treachery here. 17 counselors there were, all known to him. All of them had espoused his cause when he ascended the throne. "Men of Valusia," he began in the most conventional manner, then halted, perplexed. The counselors had risen as a man and were moving toward him. There was no hostility in their looks, but their actions were strange for a council room. The foremost was close to him when Brule sprang forward, crouched like a leopard. "Kanamaka la Germa," his voice crackled through the sinister silence of the room, and the foremost counselor recoiled, hand flashing to his robes, and, like a spring released, Brule moved, and the man pitched headlong to the glint of his sword. Headlong he pitched, and lay still while his face faded and became the head of a mighty snake. "Slay, Kull," rasped the Pict's voice. "They be all serpent-men." The rest was a scarlet maze. Kull saw the familiar faces dim like fading fog, and in other places gaped horrid reptilian visages as the whole band rushed forward. His mind was dazed, but his giant body faltered not. The singing of his sword filled the room, and the onrushing flood broke in a red wave. But they surged forward again, seemingly willing to fling their lives away in order to drag down the king. Hideous jaws gaped at him. Terrible eyes blazed into his unblinkingly. A frightful fetid scent pervaded the atmosphere, the serpent scent that Kull had known in the southern jungles. Swords and daggers leaped at him, and he was dimly aware that they wounded him. But Kull was in his element. Never before had he faced such grim foes, but it mattered little. They lived. Their veins held blood that could be spilt, and they died when his great sword cleft their skulls or drove through their bodies. Slash, thrust, and swing. Yet had Kull died there but for the man who crouched at his side, parrying and thrusting? For the king was clear berserk, fighting in the terrible Atlantean way that seeks death to deal death. He made no effort to avoid thrusts and slashes, standing straight up and ever plunging forward, no thought in his frenzied mind but to slay. Not often did Kull forget his fighting craft and his primitive fury, but now some chain had broken in his soul, flooding his mind with a red wave of slaughterlust. He slew a foe at each blow, but they surged about him, and time and again Brule turned a thrust that would have slain as he crouched beside Kull, parrying and warding with cold skill, slaying not as Kull slew with long slashes and plunges, but with short overhand blows and upward thrusts. Kull laughed, a laugh of insanity. Frightful faces swirled about him in a scarlet blaze. He felt steel sink into his arm, and he dropped his sword in a flashing arc that cleft his foe to the breastbone. When the mist faded and the king saw that he and Brule stood alone above a sprawl of hideous crimson figures who lay still upon the floor. Valka! What a killing, said Brule, shaking the blood from his eyes. Kull, had these been warriors who knew how to use steel, we had died here. These serpent priests know not of swordcraft and die easier than any men I ever slew. Yet had there been a few more, I think the matter had ended otherwise. Kull nodded. The wild berserker blaze had passed, leaving a mazed feeling of great weariness. Blood seeped from the wounds on breast, shoulder, arm, and leg. Brule, himself bleeding from a score of flesh wounds, glanced at him in some concern. Lord Kull, let us hasten to have your wounds dressed by the women. Kull thrust him aside with a drunken sweep of his mighty arm. Nay, we'll see this through ere we cease. Go you, though, and have your wounds seen to it. I command it. The Pict laughed grimly. Your wounds are more than mine, Lord King, he began, then stopped as a sudden thought struck him. By Valka, Kull, this is not the council room. Kull looked about, and suddenly other fogs seemed to fade. Nay, this is the room where Ilal died 1,000 years ago, since unused, and named Accursed. Then, by the gods, they tricked us after all, exclaimed Brule in a fury, kicking the corpses at their feet. They caused us to walk like fools into their ambush. By their magic, they changed the appearance of all. Then there is further deviltry afoot, said Kull. For there be true men in the councils of Valusia, they should be in the real council room by now. Come, swiftly. And leaving the room with its ghastly keepers, they hastened through the halls that seemed deserted until they came to the real council room. Then Kull halted with a ghastly shudder. From the council room sounded a voice speaking, and the voice was his. With a hand that shook, he parted the tapestries and gazed into the room. There sat the councillors, counterparts of the men he and Brule had just slain, and upon the dais stood Kull, King of Valusia. He stepped back, his mind reeling. This is insanity, he whispered. Am I Kull? Do I stand here, or is that Kull yonder in very truth, and am I but a shadow, a figment of thought? Brule's hand clutching his shoulder, shaking him fiercely, brought him to his senses. Valka's name, be not a fool. Can you yet be astounded after all we have seen? See you not that those are true men bewitched by a snake man who has taken your form, and those others took their forms? By now you should have slain and yon monster reigning in your stead, unknown by those who bowed to you. Leap and slay swiftly, or else we are undone. The Red Slayers, true men, standing close on each side, and none but you can reach and slay him. Be swift! Kull shook off the unrushing dizziness, flung back his head in the old defiant gesture. He took a long, deep breath as does a strong swimmer before diving into the sea. Then, sweeping back the tapestries, made the dais in a single lion-like bound. Brule had spoken truly. There stood men of the Red Slayers, guardsmen trained to move quick as a striking leopard. Any but Kull had died ere he could reach the usurper. But the sight of Kull, identical with the man upon the dais, held them in their tracks, their minds stunned for an instant, and that was long enough. He sat upon the dais, snatched for his sword, but even as his fingers closed upon the hilt, Kull's sword stood out behind his shoulders, and the thing that men had thought the king pitched forward from the dais to lie silent upon the floor. Hold! Kull's lifted hand and kingly voice stopped the rush that had started, and while they stood astounded, he pointed to the thing which lay before them, whose face was fading into that of a snake. They recoiled, and from one door came Brule, and from the other came Kanu. These grasped the king's bloody hand, and Kanu spoke. Men of Valusia, you have seen with your own eyes. This is the true Kull, the mightiest king to whom Valusia has ever bowed. The power of the serpent is broken, and ye be all true men. King Kull, have you commands? Lift that carrion, said Kull, and men of the guard took up that thing. Now follow me, said the king, and he made his way to the accursed room. Brule, with a look of concern, offered the support of his arm, but Kull shook it off. The distance seemed endless to the bleeding king, but at last he stood at the door and laughed fiercely and grimly when he heard the horrified ejaculations of the councillors. At his order, the guardsmen flung the corpse they carried beside the others, and, motioning all from the room, Kull stepped out last and closed the door. A wave of dizziness left him shaken. The faces turned to him, pallid and wonderingly, swirled and mingled in a ghostly fog. He felt the blood from his wound trickling down his limbs, and he knew that what he was to do, he must do quickly or not at all. His sword rasped from its sheath. "Brule, are you there?" "Aye." Brule's face looked at him through the mist, close to his shoulder, but Brule's voice sounded leagues and eons away. "Remember our vow, Brule, and now bid them stand back." His left arm cleared a space as he flung up his sword. Then, with all his waning power, he drove it through the door into the jamb, driving the great sword to the hilt and sealing the room forever. Legs braced wide, he swayed drunkenly, facing the horrified counselors. "Let this room be doubly accursed, and let those rotting skeletons lie there forever as a sign of the dying might of the serpent. Here I swear that I shall hunt the serpent-men, from land to land, from sea to sea, giving no rest until all be slain, that good triumph and the power of hell be broken. This thing I swear, I, Kull, King of Valusia." His knees buckled as the faces swayed and swirled. The counselors leapt forward, but ere they could reach him, Kull slumped to the floor and lay still, face upward. The counselors surged about the fallen king, clattering and shrieking. Kanu beat them back, with his clenched fist, cursing savagely. "Back, you fools! Would you stifle the little life that is yet in him? How, Brule? Is he dead, or will he live?" To the warrior who bent above the prostrate Kull. "Dead?" sneered Brule irritably. "Such a man as this is not so easily killed. Lack of sleep and loss of blood have weakened him, by Valka, and he has a score of deep wounds, but none of them are mortal. Yet, have those gibbering fools bring the court women here at once." Brule's eyes lighted with a fierce, proud light. "Valka, Kanu, but there is such a man as I knew not existed in these degenerate days. He will be in the saddle in a few scant days, and then may the serpent-men of the world beware of Kull of Valusia. Valka, that will be a rare hunt. Ah, I see long years of prosperity for the world with such a king upon the throne of Valusia." Well, dear listener, King Kull sat on his throne and learned that the world beneath the world is always older and stranger than the world we think we know. How many faces in your life have you trusted without question, and what would it take to make you doubt them? If that story sent shivers down your spine, be sure to hit that like button. Have you got a story of your own that you'd like me to consider reading? Send it in to stories@silasdarkwood.com. Now, if you're not ready to wander out of the shadows, there's a card on your screen with another great story that I think you'll enjoy. And stay spooky, dear listeners. I'll be haunting your feet again soon.